The year is 1813. In the quiet hills of the Cotswolds, a new governess arrives at Harrowgate Manor, a house still mourning its lost mistress and ruled by a widowed marquess whose heart has turned to stone. But beneath the calm of the village, secrets whisper like wind through the orchards. A woman burdened by her past, a man haunted by his grief, and 5 children who will change both forever. When duty collides with forbidden affection, one choice could shatter everything or heal it. If you love powerful stories of love, redemption, and second chances, subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so we can bring you even more timeless romances like this one. Lower Ashcombe, the Cotswolds, England, 1813. The evening mist curled over the winding lanes of Lower Ashcombe, softening the stone cottages and turning their honey-coloured walls into quiet ghosts of light. Sheep grazed on the rolling hills, bells faint in the distance, while smoke drifted from the chimneys of a village preparing for supper. It was the kind of evening meant for warmth and stillness, yet the rumble of a lone carriage shattered that peace. Inside the modest coach sat Blanche Fairley, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her grey-blue eyes fixed on the landscape that grew dimmer with every turn. Her gown of pale cream muslin, though carefully mended, spoke of gentility reduced to necessity. She had been told this journey would save her reputation. She suspected it was meant to bury it. When the carriage halted before the great gates of Harrowgate Manor, Blanche drew a slow breath. The ironwork stood like sentinels, slick with rain, and beyond them rose a house that seemed carved from morning itself, grand, silent, and shuttered. The door opened, and the coachman's voice broke through the cold. "We've arrived, miss." Blanche stepped down into the damp evening air. Her bonnet ribbon fluttered against her cheek, and for a moment she hesitated, staring up at the windows, most of them dark. She felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her, the houses, the staffs, perhaps even the ghosts of those who once laughed within these walls. At the entrance waited Mrs. Willoughby, the housekeeper, her severe figure outlined by the golden light of a single candle. "You are Miss Fairley, I presume," she said, her tone clipped. "The children are abed. His lordship will see you in the morning. I suggest you rest. It will be a long week." "A week," Blanche repeated softly. "Few governesses stay longer." The words lingered like a chill draught as Blanche followed the woman through the echoing corridors. The air smelled faintly of wax and faded flowers, as though someone had tried, years ago, to preserve life here, and failed. That night, her room was small but orderly. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a single candle. Blanche removed her gloves and traced the chain of a locket hidden beneath her gown. Inside was a miniature of her late mother, the only face that had ever looked upon her without judgment. "I'll manage," she whispered into the dimness, her voice trembling with the effort of belief. But as she was about to lie down, she heard it, the faint sound of a child's sob muffled through the corridor wall. She froze, listening. Then another soft whimper, so full of pain it seemed to reach straight into her chest. She hesitated only a moment before taking up her candle and stepping into the hall. Shadows danced along the panelled walls as she followed the sound to a door at the far end. It was locked. She pressed her palm against it gently. "Sweetheart," she murmured, her voice tender but steady. "You're not alone. Go to sleep now. You're safe." Silence answered her, followed by a faint rustle, then stillness. Blanche lingered there a moment longer before returning to her room, unaware that behind another door someone else was awake. In a study lit only by the dying fire, Marquis Augustus Hawthorne stood by the window, the embers painting sharp planes across his face. He had heard the soft echo of a woman's voice in the corridor and knew it was the new governess. "She's different," murmured Mr. Pemberton, the steward, standing at a respectful distance. Augustus's eyes did not leave the window. "They all seem different when they arrive," he said quietly, "and then they learn what this house truly is. She seems capable, my lord." He turned slightly, the edge of his profile illuminated by the firelight. We shall see. Discipline, not sympathy, is what this household requires." When the steward withdrew, Augustus remained where he was, watching the candlelight flicker in the far hallway. The sound of that gentle voice, her voice, had carried through the silence like the faintest crack in stone. For reasons he could not name, he felt it linger. Morning came with a grey sky, and the clatter of hooves in the courtyard. Blanche descended the staircase, her hair neatly arranged beneath her bonnet, her muslin gown concealed beneath a navy wool spencer. The house, vast and echoing, felt like a cathedral emptied of faith. Mrs. Willoughby led her into the breakfast room, where 5 children sat in stony quiet before untouched porridge. The eldest, a boy of 12, met Blanche's gaze with brittle defiance. The youngest, barely 4, hid behind a chair. "Good morning," Blanche said gently, her tone warm but firm. "I am Miss Fairley. I'm very pleased to meet you all." The children said nothing. The eldest merely lifted his chin as if to test her courage. Then, behind them, a door opened. Every child went rigid. The man who entered wore black. Black waistcoat, black cravat, black as morning could be. Marquis Augustus Hawthorne had the presence of a man accustomed to command, and yet there was something restrained in the way he moved, as though each gesture was measured to keep grief from spilling out. "Miss Fairley," he said, his voice low and even, "I trust you found your accommodations acceptable." "Yes, my lord," she replied, curtsying. "The house is beautiful." "Beautiful," he repeated softly, his gaze resting on her for the first time. "That is one word for it." Their eyes met. For an instant, neither spoke. There was no spark of recognition, no flirtation, only the silent collision of 2 souls accustomed to loss. He turned toward the children. "You will respect Miss Fairley. You will obey her instructions as you would mine. Do I make myself clear?" 5 heads nodded. 5 voices murmured assent. When he looked back at Blanche, she saw that his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "You will find this household values discipline and order above all else. The rest is unnecessary." "I believe, my lord," she answered quietly, "that kindness and order can exist together." The smallest child peeked from behind a chair, curious. Augustus's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in something far more complex. "You'll discover soon enough, Miss Fairley, that kindness invites disappointment." He left the room, his boots echoing down the marble corridor. Blanche exhaled slowly, then looked at the children. 5 pairs of eyes filled with confusion, defiance, and something else beneath. Longing. She offered them a faint smile. "Then let us begin, shall we?" Outside, the bells of the village tolled softly over the hills. Inside Harrowgate Manor, a new sound was born, a woman's gentle voice breaking the silence of grief. And though no one would say it aloud, something in the air shifted, fragile and new, as if the house itself had taken a breath after years of holding it. The first morning at Harrowgate dawned beneath a pale sky, veiled by mist. A thin light filtered through the tall windows of the nursery, falling on shelves of forgotten toys and the silent faces of 5 children who seemed more like shadows than the living. Blanche Fairley stood among them, feeling both out of place and strangely resolute. The air carried a chill that spoke of long winters and of hearts frozen long before she arrived. She began with gentle words. "We shall start with names, shall we not? A household feels warmer when names are spoken aloud." The eldest, Henry, sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped behind his back. "We already know our names," he said without looking up. His voice was the careful echo of his father's, low, measured, unyielding. Blanche smiled softly, refusing to be discouraged. "Then you must allow me to learn them too." The second child, a boy of 10 with restless hands and a spark of defiance in his dark eyes, muttered, "You'll leave before week's end. They all do." "I might," she answered simply, arranging her papers with calm precision. "But until then, we shall at least know one another." Her words, light and steady, fell into the stillness like drops of rain. There was no warmth yet, only curiosity buried beneath disbelief. The younger ones shifted uneasily, watching her as though expecting the inevitable outburst of impatience that every governess had offered before departing. Blanche gave them none. Lessons began. She opened a worn copy of Aesop's Fables, her tone even and clear, and read aloud until the smaller children began to listen, despite themselves. When she paused, she asked, "What do you think the fox wanted most?" "The grapes," whispered the smallest girl. "And why couldn't he reach them?" "Because," said the child shyly, "he didn't try again." Blanche's heart softened. "Sometimes, my dear, trying again is the only way to live." From the corridor, unseen by them, Augustus Hawthorne watched through the half-open door. He had not intended to observe, yet something in the quiet music of Blanche's voice held him captive. The children were not obedient, not yet, but they were listening. He turned away before he could admit to himself that it stirred something dangerous, the memory of hope. Later that morning, Blanche descended to the breakfast room, where Mrs. Willoughby awaited her with folded arms. "His lordship expects a report on the children's progress. He values discipline above all things." "I understand," Blanche said politely. "Discipline without affection is cruelty in disguise." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. "You may find, Miss Fairley, that affection breeds disobedience." "Then perhaps obedience is not what the heart needs most," Blanche murmured. When she returned upstairs, she found the children quarreling over slates. The eldest scolded, the second shouted, and one of the younger girls began to cry in silence, hiding her face against the table. Blanche crossed the room swiftly and knelt beside her. "No tears in this house," the eldest said stiffly. "Father forbids it." Blanche looked up at him. "And what do you think, Henry? Do you believe tears make one weak?" He hesitated, startled by the question. "It's not about belief, Miss Fairley. It's about what is proper." "Proper," she repeated softly, brushing the child's curls from her damp cheek. "Do you know, Henry, that sometimes the heart must choose between what is proper and what is merciful?" He frowned but said nothing. At noon, a bell rang, summoning Blanche to the study. She followed the long corridor, lined with portraits, stern ancestors with eyes that seemed to follow her as she walked. When she entered, Augustus was standing by the window, gloved hands clasped behind his back. The light from the overcast sky outlined the rigid strength of his shoulders. "Miss Fairley," he began without turning, "Mrs. Willoughby informs me that you permitted the children to cry." Blanche stopped near the threshold, unwilling to advance without permission. "I did not permit it, my lord. I comforted it." He turned, and the distance between them felt charged, not by anger alone, but by something unspoken. "You mistake comfort for indulgence. My children require strength, not sentiment." "They require both," she said, her tone calm but her pulse quickening. He studied her in silence for a moment, eyes dark and assessing. "You speak as though you know grief intimately, Miss Fairley." "Perhaps I do," she answered. "But grief does not vanish when ignored, my lord. It only grows quiet and waits." His gaze flickered briefly toward the fire, where logs cracked softly. For a breath, she thought she saw sorrow cross his face, real, raw, and terribly human. But when he spoke again, his voice was cool. "Do not mistake my leniency today for approval. Harrowgate runs on order. Disruption, even from compassion, cannot be tolerated." Blanche curtsied with poise. "Then I must hope, my lord, that one day order and compassion will learn to share a table." She turned and left before he could reply, her hands trembling once the door closed. That evening, the house seemed to breathe around her, timidly, suspiciously, as if aware of the quiet rebellion now stirring within its walls. Blanche sat at her small writing desk by candlelight, recording her thoughts in a thin journal she had carried since girlhood. "They do not need another set of rules," she wrote. "They need someone who sees them. Perhaps that is why I was sent here, not to teach, but to remember." A knock startled her. She rose and opened the door to find the eldest boy standing there, pale and hesitant. "Father wishes you to dine downstairs this evening. He says he must speak with you privately." "Thank you, Henry," she smiled gently. "And you, are you well?" He shrugged. "I'm not supposed to talk about feelings." "Then perhaps you might talk about anything else," she said, amused. "The weather, perhaps?" He almost smiled, but turned away quickly, muttering, "You'll leave, they all do." When Blanche entered the dining room later, the contrast to the nursery was stark. Crystal gleamed under the light of tall candles. Silver reflected the fire's glow. Augustus stood by the mantel, his posture immaculate, his expression unreadable. "My lord," she greeted softly. "Miss Fairley," he replied, gesturing toward a chair opposite his. "Sit." She obeyed, feeling the tension in the air like the tight string of a violin. Dinner was served, soup, roasted pheasant, and wine she barely touched. They ate in silence until he spoke. "Mrs. Willoughby informs me you found the East Wing yesterday." "I did, my lord. I was unaware it was forbidden." "It is not forbidden," he said sharply, then paused, lowering his tone. "It is simply unnecessary." Blanche looked at him across the candlelight, her voice soft but unwavering. Unnecessary or painful? His gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time she saw the storm behind his control. "You presume much, Miss Fairley." "I only observe," she answered gently, "and I see a house kept alive by duty but starved of affection. That cannot be what your late lady would have wished." Augustus's jaw tightened, his voice nearly a whisper. "You will not speak of her." Blanche inclined her head, remorseful yet steady. "Forgive me. I meant no disrespect." He studied her face, the candlelight glinting in her eyes like reflected water. "You have courage, I'll grant you that. Most women would tremble before contradicting me." "Perhaps trembling accomplishes nothing," she said softly. Something flickered across his features, an almost smile born of unwilling admiration. Then, as quickly as it came, it vanished. "Courage will not save you in this house, Miss Fairley." She held his gaze. "Then I suppose I must rely on truth." The silence that followed felt heavy with words neither dared speak. Outside, wind pressed against the windows, and rain began to fall, soft as sorrow. After dinner, he escorted her to the door himself, an unexpected courtesy. As she curtsied, his voice stopped her. "Miss Fairley." "Yes, my lord?" He hesitated, as though weighing something within. "You have a steadiness that disturbs me." She met his eyes, her heart fluttering once before she steadied it. "Then I am honored to be a disturbance." For an instant, they stood close enough for the light of one candle to touch both their faces. His breath stirred the ribbon at her collar. Her pulse quickened at the nearness. But then he stepped back, retreating into the armor of propriety. "Good night, Miss Fairley." "Good night, my lord." When she returned upstairs, the corridors of Harrowgate seemed less silent than before. Somewhere a clock chimed softly, marking the hour. The children slept, the storm whispered against the roof. Blanche paused outside the nursery, her candle trembling in her hand. Through the half-open door, she saw the smallest child clutching a blanket, lips moving in a dream. Without entering, Blanche whispered, "Sleep peacefully, little one. Tomorrow will be kinder." Downstairs in the study, Augustus sat before the dying fire, his glass of brandy untouched. The rain tapped against the window pane like a relentless memory. He thought of her, her voice, her gaze, her words. There was something about her that unsettled the quiet order he had built, something that reminded him of life. "She'll leave," he murmured to himself, echoing his son's prediction. Yet even as he said it, he found he did not wish it to be true. He closed his eyes and saw her face again, the calm defiance, the compassion she carried like light in her hands, and knew that the presence of Miss Blanche Fairley had already changed the rhythm of Harrowgate. He had spent years mastering silence, and now, for the first time, the silence felt unbearable. In her small room above, Blanche wrote once more before extinguishing her candle. "He believes strength is silence," she wrote, "but silence is the loneliest strength of all." When she set down her pen, the wind outside fell quiet. and the manor seemed to exhale as if acknowledging that a new season of change, of tenderness, of perilous emotion had begun to breathe within its walls. Morning came to Harrowgate wrapped in fog. The light that filtered through the tall windows was pale and hesitant, as though uncertain it belonged in that house at all. Blanche fairly stood in the nursery before the long table, surrounded by the quiet disorder of her pupils. The children had grown used to her presence, if not with affection, then at least with curiosity. But beneath that fragile calm, there still lingered the fear she had felt from the first moment she arrived. It was Henry, the eldest, who broke the silence. "Father says perfection is the only way to honor our name." Blanche looked up from the slates she was collecting. "And do you believe that, Henry?" His small shoulders stiffened. "It doesn't matter what I believe. He's the Marquis." She watched him for a long moment, her heart tightening with an ache she refused to show. The boy's voice carried the echo of a man twice his age. Around him, the younger children copied his stillness like an inherited command. Blanche knelt to the smallest girl, smoothing a loose curl from her brow. "Mistakes are how we learn, my dear. Even a marquis once fell from his horse before learning to ride." The littlest child giggled softly, quickly covering her mouth as if laughter were forbidden. The sound made Blanche's eyes warm, and for an instant she forgot the walls that pressed around them. But the fragile moment shattered when the door opened and Mrs. Willoughby entered, her expression tight as a noose. "Miss Fairley," she announced, "His lordship requires your presence in the west corridor. The steward will supervise the children." Blanche hesitated. "Now, immediately." The housekeeper's voice left no room for argument. Blanche followed, though unease stirred inside her. The west corridor was colder than the rest of the manor, the air heavy with dust and disuse. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes stern with judgment. She could not imagine why she had been called there, until she saw Mr. Pemberton waiting beside a trembling little boy. It was Thomas, the second child, whose temper was as quick as his sorrow. A broken porcelain vase lay on the floor, shards scattered like white petals. "What happened?" Blanche asked, lowering her tone. The steward's reply was curt. "He was told to stay out of the library. He disobeyed." Blanche looked down at Thomas, whose eyes were red from tears he had tried to hide. "Did you break it on purpose, child?" He shook his head violently. "It was an accident. I was trying to see the sea maps father keeps." Mrs. Willoughby folded her arms. "Accident or not, disobedience requires correction." Blanche turned to her, alarm rising. "Surely a word of reprimand is enough." "Not in this house," the housekeeper said coldly. "The Marquis believes leniency breeds rebellion." Before Blanche could speak again, Augustus appeared at the end of the corridor. His footsteps echoed with authority, his expression unreadable. He stopped before them, his gaze moving from the broken vase to his son, then to Blanche. "What is this?" His voice was quiet, but its weight filled the hall. Mrs. Willoughby began to explain, but Augustus raised a hand, silencing her. "Thomas!" The boy's lip trembled. "I didn't mean to, father." There was a moment, brief but piercing, where the father in him flickered behind the Marquis's mask. Then he turned to Mr. Pemberton. "Fetch the cane." Blanche froze. "My lord," she began softly. "Please." His eyes moved to her, calm yet dangerous. "You will not interfere." But she could not stop herself. "He is a child, not a soldier. Fear will not teach him care, only terror." His jaw tightened. "I do not remember asking for your philosophy, Miss Fairley." Thomas began to sob, shrinking away as the steward hesitated. The silence that followed was unbearable. Blanche stepped forward before she could think of consequence and placed herself between the boy and his father. "Enough," she said quietly. It was not loud, but it broke the air like thunder. Augustus's expression did not change, yet something in the air shifted, an invisible collision of pride and conscience. The corridor seemed to narrow around them. "Step aside," he ordered. "No," Blanche whispered. "If punishment must be dealt, let it be words, not pain." The children had gathered in the doorway now, wide-eyed and breathless. Henry clutched the frame as though unsure whether to intervene. Augustus's gaze swept over them, then back to her. "You forget your place," he said, his voice like cold steel. Blanche's breath trembled, but she stood her ground. "Perhaps, my lord, because no one has yet reminded me of your children's." The silence that followed was so deep, the fire from a distant hearth could be heard snapping. For one long heartbeat, neither moved. Then Augustus spoke, his tone lower, almost strained. "Take them upstairs, Miss Fairley." Blanche blinked, uncertain she had heard correctly. "Now," he repeated. She nodded and gathered the children quickly, guiding them back to the nursery. When the door closed behind them, her knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall. The children watched her in silence until the smallest spoke, her voice trembling. "Are you angry with father?" Blanche knelt beside her. "No, my dear. I am only sad that he carries so much sorrow he cannot yet see how much he loves you." The littlest girl reached for Blanche's hand. He loved mother. Then she went away, and he stopped loving anything. The words pierced Blanche deeper than any accusation. She brushed the child's hair tenderly, her own throat tightening. Then perhaps he only forgot how. Sometimes grief makes the heart forget its language. Later, when the children had been coaxed into calmness, Blanche went to her room. The candle flickered low as she tried to steady her breathing. She had defied a nobleman, her employer, a man of power who could dismiss her with a single command. And yet, as she remembered the look in his eyes when she stood between him and his son, she felt something she could not name. It was not fear. It was recognition. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mr. Pemberton, hat in hand, his face grave. "His lordship requests your presence in the library." Her pulse quickened. "At this hour?" "He insists." The library was vast and dimly lit, its shelves climbing high into shadow. Augustus stood by the fire, his coat unbuttoned, his cravat loosened as though even he could not bear the suffocation of his own rules. When Blanche entered, he did not turn. "You humiliated me before my children," he said at last. She clasped her hands. "I meant no humiliation, my lord, only mercy." "Mercy," he repeated bitterly. "You presume to know what that means in this house." She took a cautious step closer. "Then tell me, what does it mean to you?" He turned then, and the light caught his face, tired, haunted, yet beautiful in its quiet despair. "It means weakness. It means remembering her." Blanche's breath caught. "Their mother," he nodded once. "She pitied everyone, every beggar, every orphan, every stray creature. And what did it bring her? Sickness, exhaustion, and death. Mercy destroyed her." Blanche felt tears rise, but she held them back. "It was not mercy that destroyed her, my lord. It was the world's cruelty for which she had too much heart." Augustus's eyes darkened. "You know nothing of my pain." "No," she whispered, stepping closer still, "but I know what it is to lose everything that gave you warmth. I know how silence feels when it replaces laughter. And I know that grief is not a prison, my lord, unless you make it one." He stared at her, his breathing uneven. The firelight flickered between them, turning the space into something both sacred and perilous. "You should fear me," he murmured. "Why?" Blanche's voice trembled but did not falter. "Because you believe yourself a monster. You are not." Their eyes locked, and for a moment the distance between them vanished. She saw the man beneath the title stripped of armor, raw with guilt. He saw a woman who dared to stand before him without trembling, a woman who saw him not as a marquess, but as a man who still could be redeemed. Then he stepped back, as though the nearness burned. "Leave," he said softly, "before I forget myself." Blanche hesitated, the air thick with everything unsaid. "Good night, my lord." He did not answer, only turned toward the fire. His hand pressed against the mantel, as if steadying himself against the force of something he did not wish to feel. When she left, her heart was beating too fast, her palms cold. The house seemed different now, still vast, still sorrowful, but alive in a way it had not been before. Outside, rain began again, whispering against the windows. From her chamber, Blanche looked out into the darkness, her reflection faint against the glass. Somewhere in that silence, she sensed the Marquess standing alone in the library, as lost as she once had been. Perhaps, she murmured to her reflection, the cruelest punishment is the one we give ourselves. And as she extinguished her candle, the echo of his gaze remained with her, haunting, restrained, and impossibly tender beneath the weight of his pride. The following days passed beneath a sky of restless grey, as though the heavens themselves could not decide between storm and calm. Inside Harrowgate the air had shifted, imperceptibly but undeniably. The servants spoke in quieter tones. The children no longer moved like shadows afraid of their own voices, and the great house that once seemed carved from mourning began to breathe again. Yet, beneath the fragile peace, something deeper was awakening. A pulse Blanche fairly could feel every time the Marquis's voice crossed the air, every time his footsteps echoed down the marble corridors. That morning, she stood in the nursery beside the window, brushing a smudge of chalk from her gown. The children were practicing their handwriting under her patient eye. The youngest, her curls falling into her eyes, looked up suddenly. "Miss Fairley," she whispered, "Father looked at you last night at dinner." Blanche paused, a faint warmth rising to her cheeks. "Did he?" Henry, the eldest, smirked with the confidence of a boy already observing the adult world. "He doesn't look at anyone that way," he said bluntly. "Not even Lady Cressida when she visits." "Lady Cressida?" Blanche repeated lightly, though her hand trembled faintly as she turned a page. "She comes to dine sometimes," Henry explained. "She brings father books and letters from London." Blanche managed a smile. How very kind of her. The children's chatter faded as she returned to the lesson, yet their words echoed in her thoughts. Lady Cressida Vale. The name stirred something unpleasant, a cold ripple beneath the calm surface of her composure. Blanche had seen that kind of woman before. Polished, poised, her kindness sharp as glass. She dismissed the feeling quickly, reminding herself that the life of a governess left no room for jealousy. After lessons, she descended to the courtyard, the children tumbling ahead of her with shouts of delight. For the first time, their laughter carried across the estate without fear. Mrs. Willoughby watched from a window, shaking her head as though such joy were improper. But Blanche could not bring herself to silence them. The day was unusually mild for early spring. The sky cleared enough to reveal a soft blue behind drifting clouds, and the scent of damp earth rose from the garden paths. Blanche bent to pick a fallen branch when she heard the sound of approaching hooves. A horse, dark as night, slowed near the gate. Augustus dismounted with effortless grace, his gloved hands steady on the reins. The children ran toward him, their cries of "Father!" startling him for a heartbeat before his face softened. He greeted them in turn, awkwardly, as if he had forgotten the language of tenderness, but was learning it again, one touch at a time. Blanche watched from a distance, her heart full and aching all at once. He was no longer only the austere figure who had ruled the house with silence. He was a man rediscovering the weight and wonder of love. When his gaze found hers, the air changed. He walked toward her slowly, the sunlight catching in his dark hair, the outline of his coat sharp against the pale sky. "Miss Fairley," he greeted, his tone calm but threaded with something quieter, something that trembled beneath restraint. "My lord," she replied, curtsying slightly. "The children have made remarkable progress. They now read to one another without quarrel. I have noticed." He paused, studying her face with that same unreadable intensity that made her breath falter. "The house has been different since your arrival." "Different?" "Quieter," he said, then hesitated. "No, that is not the word. Alive." Her lips parted slightly, but no answer came. For a long moment they stood beneath the half-blooming vines that framed the courtyard arch, neither daring to move closer, neither willing to step back. A carriage rolled into view along the lane. The sound broke the spell. A bright laugh drifted from the open window. Light, practiced, unmistakably feminine. Lady Cressida Vale. She stepped down with the grace of a woman accustomed to being admired. Her gown of lavender silk shimmered faintly in the sunlight, the color perfectly chosen to flatter her complexion. She greeted Augustus with familiarity that felt rehearsed, pressing his hand just a moment too long. "My dear Marquis," she said sweetly, "how delightful to find you outdoors. I have brought the latest periodicals from London, and a few letters you might find intriguing." Her gaze flickered toward Blanche, assessing and dismissing in a single glance. "And this must be the new governess. I have heard much about you." "Lady Cressida," Blanche said with poise, offering a curtsy. "It is a pleasure." "I'm certain," Cressida murmured, her smile never reaching her eyes. "It takes a special sort of courage to manage 5 children and a house of this size. I imagine it leaves little time for other pursuits." The meaning behind her tone was clear. Blanche's composure did not waver. "The children are my greatest pursuit, my lady. Their happiness is reward enough." Cressida's expression tightened for an instant before she turned back to Augustus. "The vicarage is hosting a small gathering tomorrow. Nothing extravagant, simply a chance for the village to remember its manners. I do hope you will attend. And of course, you must bring your charming governess. The poor dear must be dreadfully lonely in this great house." Augustus hesitated. His gaze flickered toward Blanche, whose eyes met his briefly. "If Miss Fairley wishes to attend, she may accompany the children," he said evenly. "Wonderful," Lady Cressida replied, satisfaction curling through her voice. "I shall inform the vicar." As she departed, her perfume lingered in the air like the memory of something unwelcome. Blanche turned to leave, but Augustus's voice stopped her. "You need not go if it displeases you," he said. She faced him again, her eyes steady. "Why should it displease me, my lord? I serve this household. To stand beside its name is part of my duty." His gaze softened, almost apologetic. "You are not like them." "Perhaps not," she murmured. "But I am still part of this world, even if only at its edge." The next afternoon arrived, bright and deceptively peaceful. The churchyard was adorned with spring garlands, and the villagers buzzed with curiosity as the Harrowgate carriage drew near. Blanche sat opposite the children, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Her gown of pale blue muslin was modest but finely made, its color softening her features. When she stepped out beside the Marquis, whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that the governess?" someone murmured. "How boldly she carries herself. She looks almost like a lady." Blanche heard every word, though her expression remained serene. Augustus offered her his arm without hesitation. The gesture, simple yet public, caused an audible gasp among the onlookers. Blanche hesitated for only a breath before resting her hand upon his sleeve. "Thank you, my lord," she said quietly. "You have nothing to thank me for," he replied, though his tone carried something like pride. Inside the vicar's hall, warmth and laughter swelled. The villagers exchanged polite greetings, and Lady Cressida moved among them like a queen among courtiers. When she approached, her eyes sparkled with the sweetness of hidden malice. "How lovely you look, Miss Fairley," she said, "though I fear you must find our humble gatherings quite beneath your education." "On the contrary," Blanche answered, smiling gently. "It is in such humble places that true kindness is often found." Lady Cressida's smile faltered. "How generous of you to think so." The evening wore on, filled with soft music and murmured conversation. Blanche moved among the villagers, helping the children find their way through introductions, her manner gentle and unpretentious. Yet everywhere she turned, she felt the weight of eyes upon her, their curiosity, their judgment, their fascination. As she stood by the window, drawing a breath of cool air, Augustus approached. "You are bearing this better than I expected," he said softly. "Do you imagine I am fragile, my lord?" He looked at her, and something inside him seemed to yield. "No, I imagine you are stronger than anyone here." Their eyes met, and the world seemed to hush for a heartbeat. The candlelight caught her face, the curve of her neck, the delicate tremor of her breath. It was a moment suspended in time, dangerous, beautiful, utterly forbidden. Then a voice sliced through the silence. "Marquis Hawthorne," Lady Cressida called sweetly, "you must help settle a debate. Some insist that affection clouds duty, while others," her eyes slid toward Blanche, "believe that love can redeem even the most ruined of reputations." Laughter rippled among the guests. Blanche felt the sting beneath the words, but she did not look away. Instead, she lifted her chin and met Cressida's gaze with quiet strength. "I believe," she said clearly, "that love, when honest, requires no redemption at all." The room fell still. Even Lady Cressida seemed momentarily disarmed. Augustus's voice broke the silence, low and unwavering. "Miss Fairley speaks with wisdom and courage." A murmur swept through the crowd, admiration mingling with scandalized surprise. Cressida forced a brittle smile, then turned away. When the evening finally ended, and the guests dispersed beneath the moonlight, Augustus escorted Blanche to the carriage. Neither spoke until the road curved away from the village, the sound of the horses' hooves steady in the dark. "You should not have had to endure that," he said at last. "I have endured worse," she replied softly. "The cruelty of words is nothing compared to the cruelty of indifference." He turned toward her, his voice rough with feeling. "They do not see you as I do." Blanche's breath caught. "And how do you see me, my lord?" He hesitated, his hand tightening on the edge of the seat. "As someone who refuses to bow to cruelty, even when the world demands it." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the trees. Then she whispered, "That is a dangerous way to see me." "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but I no longer care." The carriage rolled on beneath the moon, the air between them charged with the kind of silence that speaks more than words. Neither dared move closer, yet both knew that something irrevocable had changed. When they reached Harrowgate, Augustus helped her down, his hand lingering around hers, a fraction longer than propriety allowed. "Good night, Miss Fairley," he murmured. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Good night, my lord." As she turned away, her heart raced, not with fear, but with the dangerous certainty that what had begun as duty had already transformed into something far more perilous and far more beautiful. Rain fell over Harrowgate like a slow confession, steady and relentless. The manor's great windows blurred with it, turning the world outside into a shifting watercolor of grey and silver. Inside, the air was heavy with something unnamed, a silence thickened by unshed words and hearts that had begun to stir against the weight of duty. Blanche Fairley stood in her chamber, the faint light of a single candle trembling across her face. A letter lay unfolded on her desk. The ink had already begun to fade, but the words still burned clear enough to wound her. "Leave before your presence brings ruin." She did not know who had sent it, but the meaning was unmistakable. In the eyes of the world, she was a governess, a woman of uncertain past, too close to a man who belonged to a world she would never enter. And though she had done nothing but teach, guide and care, she felt the walls of class and propriety closing around her like a noose. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her trunk. Her few belongings fit into it with painful ease. She touched the locket at her neck, its worn gold warm against her skin. "You said to always choose dignity," she whispered to the memory of her mother. "Perhaps this is what it means, to leave before they take it from me." Downstairs, the evening meal carried on without laughter. The children sat subdued, sensing something in the air. The youngest clutched her spoon and asked in a trembling voice, "Miss Fairley, will you still be here tomorrow?" Blanche froze. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward her, searching. She forced a smile, gentle and bright, though her chest ached. "Tomorrow, and always in your lessons, my dear," she said softly. Henry, the eldest, narrowed his eyes. "You're lying," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I heard Mrs. Willoughby say you're leaving." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Blanche laid her hand over his. Sometimes, Henry, grown-ups must do what others decide for them. It does not mean they wish it so. The boy pulled his hand back, his pride shielding his pain. Father will stop you, he muttered. He always gets his way. Blanche smiled sadly. Even a marquess cannot command the wind to stay, Henry. The moment passed like a shadow across a flame. Later that night, as the clock struck 10, Blanche gathered her cloak and walked quietly toward the servants' entrance. The rain had not ceased. It whispered against the glass as if urging her to reconsider. She paused at the door, her hand on the latch, when a voice came from behind her. "Miss Fairley?" She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Augustus Hawthorne stood in the dim corridor, his expression unreadable, his hair slightly disordered, as though he too had been unable to find peace that night. "You mean to leave," he said, his tone controlled but strained beneath the surface. Blanche straightened, her voice steady. "I received a letter, my lord. It warned me that my presence here has become improper." "Improper," he repeated bitterly. "Because you dared to bring warmth into a house long dead?" "My lord," she said softly, "I cannot be the reason your name is dragged through whispers. You owe your children peace. The village already speaks. Let them." His voice was low, fierce, startling her. He took a step closer, then stopped himself, his hand tightening at his side. "Do you believe I care for their gossip?" "You should," she said. "You have a title, a family, a reputation. I have none of those things." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the air between them tremble. "You have something far rarer than any of that, Miss Fairley," he said quietly. "You have made this house breathe again." Blanche lowered her gaze, fighting the heat that rose to her cheeks. "And what good is breath if it becomes scandal, my lord?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of fatigue beneath his eyes. "Do you intend to punish me for what I feel?" Her breath caught. "You feel nothing, my lord. You grieve, you seek comfort in familiarity. I'm only a reminder that your heart is still capable of tenderness." He shook his head slowly. "You misunderstand me entirely. It is not comfort I seek." The words hung between them, trembling, forbidden. His voice softened. "When you walked into this house, you carried the light I did not know I still deserved. You taught my children to laugh again, and you forced me to remember what it was to be human." Blanche's eyes filled, though she held her composure. "And yet I am still what I am, a woman of no standing. That is something love cannot rewrite." "Love," he repeated, the word a quiet revelation. She turned away, trembling. "Forgive me, I should not have spoken." But he reached for her hand before she could move, his fingers brushing hers lightly. It was not a grasp, not even a plea, just a touch that spoke of everything they could not say aloud. "Do not go," he whispered. "Not tonight." Her eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, propriety ceased to exist. The world outside the manor could have vanished, and she would not have noticed. The candlelight glimmered on his face, softening the severity, revealing the man beneath the title, the man who had been buried in silence for far too long. "If I stay," she said in a broken whisper, "it will only make the pain greater when I must go." "Then let tomorrow be tomorrow," he answered. "Tonight, stay." Blanche felt her will waver, torn between reason and the impossible pull of his voice. But before she could reply, footsteps approached. Mrs. Willoughby appeared at the far end of the hall, her face pinched with disapproval. "My lord," she said stiffly, "the steward has urgent papers requiring your attention." Augustus's jaw tightened. "They can wait," but Blanche withdrew her hand gently. "No, my lord. Duty never waits. Go. I will not run from you." His eyes searched hers for a moment longer, then he inclined his head with restrained anguish. "We will speak in the morning," he said, "and if you still wish to leave, I will not stop you." When he was gone, Blanche stood alone in the quiet corridor, her heart pounding. The rain continued to fall, whispering secrets against the stone walls. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "Do not be foolish," she murmured. "He is a man bound by grief and guilt, not love." Yet even as she said it, her tears betrayed her disbelief. The next morning dawned grey and fragile. Blanche had not slept. She dressed in silence and began packing again. When she opened the nursery door to say her final goodbyes, she found the children waiting, wide-eyed, solemn, their breakfast untouched. "You promised," the littlest girl said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You said tomorrow and always." Blanche knelt, gathering her into her arms. "I did, my darling." "And I will always be with you here," she whispered, pressing a hand to the child's heart. Henry stepped forward, defiant as ever. "If you leave, we'll never forgive Father." "Do not be angry with him," she said gently. "He is only doing what he believes is right." "It's not right," Henry muttered. "It's cowardly." The words startled her. "Hush," she said softly. "Your father is not a coward. He simply fears losing more than he already has." The boy turned away, blinking hard. As Blanche rose, a movement at the doorway caught her eye. Augustus stood there, his expression shadowed, the morning light outlining him like a portrait framed in sorrow. "Leave us," he said quietly to the children. They hesitated but obeyed, glancing back with tearful eyes as they left. The room fell silent. "I told you," Blanche said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I would not run." "And yet you mean to," he replied, stepping closer. "Tell me, Miss Fairley, if this house has found life again, why do you insist on burying it once more?" "Because life cannot grow where the world forbids it," she said, forcing calm. "You and I live in different air, my lord. If I stay, I will suffocate in yours." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly before it found her arm. "You think me blind to class, to propriety. Perhaps once I was, but not now. Not when I see you standing before me, brave enough to defy me, kind enough to forgive me." She swallowed hard. "You mistake admiration for affection." He shook his head, his voice deep and steady. "I have known admiration, Miss Fairley. It never made my heart ache like this." Blanche's lips parted, but she could not speak. The space between them grew small, too dangerous. He lifted her hand slowly, his fingers grazing the locket at her throat. "You wear that every day," he murmured. "Whose memory do you carry inside?" "My mother's," she whispered. "She taught me that love is sacrifice." He met her gaze. "Then perhaps you have already sacrificed enough." The words undid her. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "You must not say such things to me." "Why not?" "Because I will believe them," she confessed. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them pulsed with something unspeakable, tenderness, longing, and fear all braided together. Then a soft sound broke the spell, the smallest child peeking from the door, holding her doll. "Please don't go, Miss Fairley." Blanche turned away, pressing a hand to her lips to keep from sobbing. Augustus stood frozen, his face drawn with emotion he could no longer conceal. Finally, he said quietly, "Stay, for them, if not for me. Stay until I learn how to be the father they deserve." Blanche closed her eyes, her heart torn in two. "Very well, my lord," she said at last, her voice trembling. "I will stay." Relief washed through his features, though he masked it with composure. "Then we begin again," he said softly. As she gathered the child into her arms, Blanche felt the faintest spark of hope return, fragile, flickering, but alive. And when Augustus turned to leave the room, she dared glance after him, realizing that his promise was not only for his children, it was for her. That night, as rain gave way to silence, Blanche stood by her window, looking over the sleeping hills. The candlelight traced her reflection, a woman who had come as a governess and had become the heart of a house long thought lifeless. And somewhere in the same house, a man who had sworn never to love again sat awake, listening to the echo of her voice in the halls, knowing that one night had changed everything he believed he could feel. Spring came timidly to the Cotswolds that year, brushing the stone cottages of Lower Ashcombe with shy blossoms, and light so delicate it seemed afraid to linger. The air smelled of rain and distant violets, and Harrowgate, once a monument to silence, now carried faint echoes of laughter, children's voices drifting through open windows, the creak of garden swings long unused. Blanche Fairley stood in the manor's orchard, her muslin skirts brushing against the damp grass. She had allowed the children to spend the morning outdoors, their hands stained with soil from planting new flowers along the walk. A soft breeze lifted the tendrils of hair that had escaped her bonnet, and for a rare moment she permitted herself to simply breathe. It had been weeks since that night when she nearly left, and though her resolve remained fragile, something in the air had changed between her and the Marquis, between herself and the house. The children no longer feared laughter, and Augustus no longer seemed carved entirely of stone. Yet Blanche's heart, though warmed by this transformation, carried a new kind of uncertainty, the quiet, trembling awareness of love growing where it should not. She turned at the sound of footsteps on gravel. Augustus approached, the morning light glancing off his dark coat. He moved with the controlled grace of a man who had been trained to command. Yet lately, Blanche noticed, his every gesture carried hesitation, as though even he feared what proximity to her might awaken. "My lord," she greeted softly, wiping her gloved hands on her apron. "Miss Fairley," he returned, his voice lower than usual. "I see the children have turned my garden into a battlefield of tulips." "They insisted the flowers would grow better if planted in a circle," she said with a faint smile. "Apparently, the earth listens more kindly when one speaks to it in rhyme." He watched her as she spoke, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "And you indulge them." "I teach them," she corrected gently. "But teaching is often kinder when it looks like indulgence." He nodded, as though absorbing the lesson himself. The wind stirred the branches overhead, scattering petals around them like fragments of cloud. For a moment, neither spoke. "I am to host a small gathering here tomorrow," he said finally. "A few neighbors, the vicar, Lady Cressida. It seems the village expects it. Appearances must be kept." Blanche's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, my lord. You and the children will attend," he continued. "It would seem improper to exclude you." Her gaze lowered. "Improper, my lord, or necessary?" His eyes met hers with quiet force. "Necessary, perhaps, but not for the reasons you imagine." She turned away, flustered by the weight of his tone. "Then I shall prepare their attire." He studied her profile, the delicate curve of her jaw, the faint blush coloring her cheek. For a moment he seemed about to speak again, but thought better of it. Instead, he inclined his head and walked back toward the house, leaving her heart beating far too fast. That night, Blanche sat by her small window as dusk gathered over the hills. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself, a woman who had meant to live quietly, unnoticed, who had found her heart ensnared by the very man whose distance once terrified her. She pressed her hand to her chest, as if to still it. "It cannot be," she whispered to the stars. "It must not." The following afternoon, Harrowgate came alive. Servants hurried through corridors with polished silver and trays of fresh flowers. The house, which had slept for years under the pall of grief, now glowed with renewed warmth. Blanche moved among the children, adjusting ribbons, smoothing collars, ensuring each face shone with clean joy. When she entered the drawing room, Augustus was already there, speaking with the vicar. He wore a dark navy tailcoat, the kind that emphasized his height and the restrained power in his posture. His cravat was tied with deliberate simplicity, an elegance born not of vanity, but of quiet authority. Blanche's breath caught despite herself. He turned at her arrival, and his conversation faltered. For a heartbeat, he simply looked at her. She wore a gown of pale rose muslin, modest in cut yet graceful in its simplicity. A ribbon of ivory silk encircled her waist, and her hair, arranged with care, gleamed like soft bronze beneath the afternoon light. "You look—" His voice trailed off, and he forced a polite tone. "The children are fortunate to be in such capable hands." "Thank you, my lord," she replied, though her heart heard everything his words did not say. Guests began to arrive, Lady Cressida among the first, shimmering in lilac silk and pearls, her smile too bright to be sincere. She greeted Augustus with practiced charm, then turned to Blanche with an expression of sugar and spite. "My dear Miss Fairley," she cooed, "how delightful to see you again. I dare say you've worked miracles. Why, the children look almost civilized." Blanche smiled politely. "The credit belongs to them, Lady Cressida. Children are far more capable of goodness than adults often allow." Cressida's smile faltered for a second before she turned her attention elsewhere. The afternoon unfolded beneath the golden sun. Musicians played soft airs near the terrace, and the scent of spring roses mingled with freshly brewed tea. Blanche moved among the guests, guiding the children through introductions and polite curtsies. Yet her awareness remained fixed on one presence, the Marquis, whose every movement seemed to draw her like a tide she could not resist. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the musicians struck the first notes of a waltz. The guests murmured with approval, couples pairing off upon the smooth stone terrace. Blanche stood aside, content to watch, her hands folded, when a voice came close behind her. "Do you dance, Miss Fairley?" She turned to find Augustus standing there, his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "I once did," she said quietly. "Long ago." "Then dance again," he murmured, extending his hand. Her breath faltered. "My lord, it would not be proper." "Let propriety rest," he interrupted gently. "For a single moment, let us both remember we are alive." Something inside her broke then, not in pain but in surrender. She placed her gloved hand in his. His touch was steady, reverent, as he led her onto the terrace where the final rays of sunlight painted the garden gold. They began to move slowly, cautiously at first, until the rhythm carried them into effortless grace. The world seemed to fade, the laughter and whispers dissolving into the soft swell of music. Blanche dared not look up, yet she felt his gaze upon her, felt the warmth of it, the ache of it. "You are trembling," he said softly. "It is only the breeze," she whispered. "There is no breeze," he replied, his voice a quiet confession. Her hand rested lightly against his shoulder, her fingers brushing the fine fabric of his coat. The contact was almost nothing, yet it burned through her like a living flame. She lifted her eyes then, and in his she saw what neither of them dared speak, longing, restraint, and a loneliness that had finally found its echo. The music slowed, the last note lingering like a sigh. He did not release her hand at once, and neither seemed willing to break the spell. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling, "for the dance." His answer came low, almost a whisper. "For me, it was more than that." Before she could reply, movement at the edge of the garden drew her attention. A small figure stood there, Henry the eldest, watching with a mix of confusion and fear. The sight struck Blanche like cold water. She withdrew her hand quickly. "I should see to the children," she said, stepping back. "Of course," he answered, though his expression betrayed the sting of her retreat. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Lady Cressida's laughter returned to fill the silence, and Blanche excused herself as soon as propriety allowed. She found Henry by the orchard gate, his face pale beneath the moonlight. "Henry," she said softly, kneeling to meet his gaze, "you should be inside." "I saw you," he said simply. "Father doesn't dance, not since—" He broke off, shaking his head. "He'll be angry later." Blanche touched his shoulder gently. "Your father is not angry, my dear. Only learning to live again." The boy looked uncertain, but nodded slowly. "He looks at you the way he used to look at her," he whispered, before running back toward the house. Blanche remained where she was, her hands clasped to her heart, the echo of the waltz still in her ears. The night was cool, scented with rain and roses, and the stars trembled faintly above the dark hills. When she finally returned to her chamber, she found a single bloom lying on her windowsill, a white rose, its petals still wet with dew. No note accompanied it, no signature, but Blanche knew whose hand had left it there. She pressed the flower to her lips, eyes closing, her heart aching with both joy and dread. For the first time, she no longer feared the depth of her feelings. She feared only that they had no place in the world they inhabited. And far below, in the garden where they had danced, Augustus Hawthorne stood alone among the fading lights, his hand still tingling with the memory of hers, his heart alive with a longing that frightened him more than any grief ever had. The rain had returned to Lower Ashcombe, steady and cold, draping Harrowgate in a grey melancholy that seemed to seep into its very stones. Days had passed since the garden waltz, and yet its echo lingered, like a song that refused to end. Blanche fairly carried it with her through every lesson, every quiet supper, every accidental glance that passed between her and the Marquis. The house, once so silent, now seemed alive with whispers neither of them dared voice. She tried to bury the memory. She told herself it had been nothing more than courtesy, a dance, a kindness offered in gratitude, but her heart betrayed her with every beat. When she walked through the corridors, she half expected to hear his voice behind her. When she opened a book, she found herself reading the same line again and again, her thoughts adrift. On one such morning, she found herself by the tall windows of the nursery, the light grey and still. The children were at their lessons, though their laughter occasionally rippled through the hall. Blanche smiled faintly at the sound. It was a fragile joy, but it was real. "Miss Fairley," came a soft voice. It was Mrs. Willoughby standing in the doorway, her expression unusually grave. "His lordship requests your presence in the study." Blanche's smile faded. "Has something happened?" "I could not say, miss," the housekeeper replied. "But there is a visitor." A visitor. The word sent a shiver of apprehension through Blanche. It was rare for anyone from beyond the village to call at Harrowgate unannounced. Wiping her hands on her apron, she followed the housekeeper down the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. When she entered the study, the air felt colder. Augustus Hawthorne stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. Opposite him sat a man in a dark travelling coat, his hat resting on the table beside him. His features were lean, his eyes sharp, a predator's gaze concealed beneath polished manners. At the sight of Blanche, the man smiled. "Miss Fairley," he drawled, rising, "it has been a long time." Her breath caught, the blood drained from her face. "Mr. Langford," she whispered. Augustus's eyes flicked between them. "You know this man?" Blanche clasped her trembling hands. "Once," she said softly. "Long ago." Langford chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Long ago indeed. Before the fine Miss Fairley was dismissed from her guardian's house for, how shall I put it, unseemly conduct." Augustus's expression darkened. "Choose your words carefully, sir." "Oh, I mean no offence," Langford replied, though his smile sharpened. "I simply thought his lordship ought to know the sort of woman entrusted with his children." Blanche's heart pounded. "You have no right," she said, her voice trembling. "No right!" Langford's tone turned cruel. "When you fled that house in disgrace, leaving behind whispers that never quite died. When your guardian lost his position because of your foolish heart. Enough!" Augustus's voice struck like thunder. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "You will not slander a woman under my roof." Langford tilted his head, amused. "Ah, but truth, my lord, is not slander. I speak only what London already knows. The lady's reputation is delicate." Blanche's vision swam. Every word cut deeper. Every memory she had tried to bury clawed its way to the surface. The night she had stood accused, the letters she had burned, the promise she had broken to protect another. She drew a slow breath and turned to Augustus. "It is true that my name has been stained," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "but not by my own doing." Langford laughed. "A convenient tale. Shall I tell his lordship the rest, or shall you?" Blanche met his gaze, fury burning through her fear. "Leave this house, Mr. Langford, before you forget the limits of a gentleman." He smirked, bowing with exaggerated grace. "As you wish, But I warn you, Miss Fairley, secrets have teeth. They always bite, sooner or later. When he was gone, silence fell heavy as stone. The fire snapped once in the hearth, throwing sparks against the grate. Augustus turned to her. "Is any of what he said true?" Her throat tightened. "Yes and no. That is not an answer. I cannot give you more," she said, her composure breaking. "It concerns someone I swore to protect. To speak would betray them." He studied her for a long moment, the storm in his eyes barely restrained. "You think I cannot help you unless you tell me everything?" "I know you cannot," she whispered, "because even the truth cannot erase what society believes." His jaw clenched. "Then let them believe what they wish. I have seen your character, Miss Fairley. It speaks louder than gossip." Her eyes shimmered. "You are kind, my lord, but kindness cannot change the world." For the first time since she met him, Augustus looked away, not in anger, but in something like pain. "You think too little of me," he said quietly. Before she could respond, Henry burst through the door, his face pale. "Father," he gasped, "the man who was here, he was speaking to the servants. He said terrible things about Miss Fairley." Augustus's expression hardened. "Where?" "In the courtyard," the boy said. "He said she'd ruined her last employer and that she'd do the same here." Blanche's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh, dear God!" Without another word, Augustus strode from the room. Blanche followed at a distance, fear twisting in her chest. When they reached the courtyard, Langford was there, speaking to a small knot of servants. He turned at the sound of the Marquess's voice. "Enough," Augustus said coldly. "You will leave this property at once." Langford sneered. "Perhaps I will, but others will not forget what I've said. London's whispers travel quickly, even to your quiet little corner of Gloucestershire." "Then let them travel," Augustus said. "They will find no welcome here." He signalled to the steward, who escorted the man to his carriage. The servants scattered, whispering. When the sound of wheels faded down the drive, Augustus turned to Blanche. "I will not ask again," he said softly. "But if you ever wish to tell me the truth, I will listen." Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "You already know the truth, my lord," she whispered. "You see it in who I am now, not in what I was." He took a slow step closer. The rain had begun again, falling lightly, gathering on her lashes. "Then let that be enough." Blanche shook her head. "It will never be enough for them." "Then let it be enough for me." The words, spoken with quiet conviction, unravelled her entirely. She stood trembling, unable to look at him, for fear her heart would betray her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "You should not say such things." "Why not?" he asked, his tone low, almost tender. "Because they are unwise? Because they are forbidden?" She looked up at him then, and for an instant the world shrank to the space between them. The faint rain, the scent of earth, the unspoken confession that lived in their eyes. "Because," she said, "if you continue, I will begin to believe them." He smiled faintly, a sorrowful, beautiful smile. "Then let me be your ruin." Her breath caught. "Do not tempt fate, my lord. Fate has tempted me since the day you arrived." A crack of thunder rolled in the distance, breaking the moment. He stepped back, reclaiming his composure. "Go inside," he said gently. "You'll catch cold." Blanche obeyed, though her legs trembled beneath her. As she reached the doorway, she turned once more. He stood where she had left him, the rain darkening his coat, his head bowed as if in prayer. That night, the manor seemed restless. Wind swept through the halls, rattling windows, carrying the ghosts of old whispers. Blanche sat at her desk, her candle flickering, and wrote in her journal, "He knows I am not innocent in the world's eyes, and still he defends me. How cruel that love should bloom from gratitude, when it can never be spoken aloud." Downstairs, Augustus remained in his study long after the fire had died, staring at the embers. He thought of the cruel man's words, of Blanche's trembling defiance, of the way her eyes held truth and sorrow in equal measure. For the first time in years, his heart warred against his reason, and reason was losing. He whispered into the darkness, his voice barely more than breath. "If loving her is folly, then let me be the greatest fool in England." And somewhere above, in her room, Blanche closed her journal and pressed her hand to her heart, as if she had heard him. The sky over Harrowgate hung heavy with storm clouds, bruised and trembling, as though the heavens themselves struggled to contain what was coming. Inside the manor, the air felt thick with a similar unease, charged, expectant, alive with unspoken truths. It had been 3 days since Mr. Langford's visit, and though his shadow had departed, its venom lingered in every whispered glance from the servants, in the wary politeness of villagers who now looked upon Blanche Fairley with a hint of suspicion. She bore it with grace. She always did. But that grace had begun to cost her. Each morning, as she stood before the nursery window watching the mist crawl over the hills, her reflection looked thinner, paler, like a flame that burned too steadily in the wind. That evening, she took the children for a walk along the orchard path before supper. The trees had begun to flower again, their white petals falling softly over the grass like snow. The smallest girl clutched Blanche's hand tightly. "Will he come back, Miss Fairley?" she asked. "Who, my dear?" "The man who said wicked things." Blanche smiled faintly, though her heart squeezed. "No, darling. He has gone where wicked words fade away." The child nodded solemnly. "Father was angry." "He never gets angry. Not like that." Blanche hesitated. "Your father is not a cruel man, only a wounded one. Sometimes pain speaks before reason." Henry, walking ahead, called out suddenly, "Father's in the stables." Blanche's pulse quickened. She had not seen Augustus since that dreadful afternoon. Their paths had crossed only in passing, formal, distant, both unwilling to stir the fragile calm that now blanketed the house. But she could not deny that her heart leapt at the thought of him. She told the children to return to the house and made her way toward the stables. The scent of rain-soaked hay and horses greeted her, rich and earthy. Augustus stood beside one of the stalls, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He moved with the quiet strength of a man who needed to occupy his hands to silence his mind. "My lord," she began softly. He turned at once. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw tense. "Miss Fairley." "I came to thank you," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm, "for defending me that day. It was not your place to do so, yet you did." "It was very much my place," he replied, wiping his hands with a cloth. "No one maligns someone under my protection." She smiled faintly. "Protection can be a dangerous kindness, my lord. It gives others reason to speak even more." "Let them," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I will not allow your name to be tarnished by lies." "Even if they were not all lies?" she whispered. He froze. "What do you mean?" Her gaze fell to the ground. "There was a scandal years ago. A false accusation that I—" She stopped, shaking her head. "It does not matter now. The world believed what it wished, as it always does. My guardian lost his fortune defending me, and I was dismissed without a reference. Since then, every position I've held has ended the same way. Until here." Augustus stepped closer, his expression softening. "You were punished for another's sin." "I was punished for trusting," she said bitterly, "and I swore I would never trust again." "And yet you came here." She met his gaze then, and something within her trembled. "Yes, I came here, and I trusted you." The rain began to drum against the roof, filling the silence between them. He took another step forward, close enough that she could see the faint scar near his temple, the line of fatigue at the corner of his mouth. "Miss Fairley," he said quietly, "I must tell you something. When you first arrived, I intended only to hire a governess, someone to restore order, nothing more. But order became warmth, warmth became peace, and peace—" He stopped, his breath unsteady. "Peace became you." Her lips parted, her heart thundering. "My lord, you must not—" "I must," he interrupted, his tone low and urgent. Because every day I do not speak, I am consumed by silence. You have changed this house, Blanche. You have changed me, and if the world condemns me for saying it, so be it." Her name on his lips was both salvation and ruin. She felt her composure falter. "You cannot mean this," she whispered. "You are a marquess. I am—" "You are everything I did not know I needed," he said, stepping closer still. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the stall in stark silver light. Blanche turned away, trembling. "This is madness," she said, her voice shaking. "It cannot be. The world would call it scandal, folly, worse." "Do you love the world, Miss Fairley?" he asked, his tone almost desperate. She looked back at him, tears shining in her eyes. "No," she said softly, "but I have lived too long in its judgment to forget its cruelty." He reached out then, his hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was gentle, reverent, but it sent fire through her veins. She closed her eyes, fighting the pull that threatened to undo everything she had built within herself. "You are trembling," he murmured. "Because I do not know how to stop feeling," she confessed. For a moment, the storm seemed to quiet. His hand hovered near her face, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. Then the stable door creaked open, and they stepped apart as Henry's voice echoed through the space. "Father! The vicar's come!" Augustus's composure returned in an instant. "Tell him I will be there shortly," he said, his tone even. The boy nodded and disappeared as quickly as he'd come. Blanche turned away, her breath uneven. "I should go," she whispered. He reached for her hand before she could move. "Blanche!" She froze at the sound of her name, her heart breaking beneath the weight of it. "You need not answer now," he said, his voice quiet, strained. "But know this, whatever the world says, whatever ghosts linger in your past, you have my faith and my heart." The tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She did not trust her voice enough to speak. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes full of everything she could not say aloud. Then she withdrew her hand and fled into the rain. The storm broke in earnest as night fell. Wind battered the shutters, and thunder rolled over the hills. Blanche sat by her window, wrapped in her shawl, staring out at the darkened landscape. Her pulse still carried the echo of his words. "You have my heart." She pressed her fingers to her lips, as though the touch might silence the memory. "You fool," she whispered to herself. "You foolish, lonely heart." Below, in his study, Augustus stood before the fire, his hands clenched at his sides. The rain lashed against the windows, but he barely heard it. His thoughts were only of her courage, her sadness, the fire in her eyes when she spoke the truth. He had spent years living among ghosts, and now for the first time he feared what it meant to live among the living. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Willoughby entered, her face pale. "My lord," she said, "there is a matter that cannot wait. The vicar brings word from the bishop's office. They inquire about Miss Fairley's position. It seems someone has written from London." "Who?" Augustus demanded. "They did not say, my lord. Only that the letter suggests she is unfit for service." He felt the blood drain from his face. "Langford," he said darkly. "He has not finished his work. What shall we do?" He turned to the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes. "We do nothing," he said. "If they come for her, they will go through me first." Mrs. Willoughby hesitated. "And the scandal, my lord?" He looked at her then, his expression calm but unyielding. "Scandal is a small price for truth." When she left, Augustus remained where he was, staring into the fire. The rain hammered harder against the windows, and thunder rattled the floorboards, but he did not move. Upstairs, Blanche could not sleep. She stood at her window, watching lightning flash over the distant hills. Her reflection in the glass looked both familiar and strange, a woman who had once fled from ruin and now stood on the edge of it again, but for love this time, not shame. And though she tried to quiet her heart, she could not forget the way he had looked at her in the stables, nor the quiet certainty in his voice when he said she had changed him. For the first time since she arrived at Harrowgate, she allowed herself to whisper what she had never dared to name. "I love him," she breathed into the darkness, the words trembling like prayer. Outside, the storm raged, but deep within the house, two hearts beat in quiet defiance of the world. A nobleman and a governess, divided by class, bound by feeling, and standing at the edge of a truth that would soon demand to be spoken aloud. Dawn came reluctantly to Harrowgate, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise upon a house trembling on the edge of ruin and revelation. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in the dripping eaves and the scent of wet earth that clung to the air. The silence that followed was not peace. It was anticipation, fragile and dangerous. Blanche Fairley sat by the nursery fire, her hands still trembling from the sleepless night. The children played quietly nearby, their voices subdued, their eyes darting toward her with unspoken worry. They sensed, what she could not yet bring herself to say aloud, that something was coming, something that would change everything. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Willoughby entered, her expression grave. "Miss Fairley," she said softly, "there is a visitor. The vicar requests to speak with you privately." Blanche rose, her breath catching. At this hour, he insisted it was urgent. Blanche glanced toward the children, then nodded. "Tell him I will meet him in the study." The walk through the corridors felt endless. Every portrait, every polished surface seemed to watch her, as though the house itself waited to see what she would do. When she entered the study, the vicar stood near the window, his hat in his hands, his face heavy with concern. "Miss Fairley," he began gently, "forgive the intrusion. I would not come unannounced if it were not a matter of some delicacy." "Please," she said, clasping her hands, "what has happened?" He hesitated. "A letter has arrived at the bishop's office in Gloucester. It bears the seal of a London solicitor. The contents accuse you of moral misconduct and unfit behaviour during your previous employment." Blanche felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Who sent it?" "The letter is unsigned," the vicar said carefully, "but it was accompanied by a sworn statement. It is said to come from one Mr. Langford." Her breath broke. "He would not dare—" "I believe he already has," the vicar replied. "The bishop has written to Lord Hawthorne, requesting that he dismiss you at once to preserve his household's reputation." Blanche pressed a hand to her chest. The room seemed to spin, the edges of her vision blurring. "I see," she whispered. "And has his lordship been told?" "I came here first," the vicar said kindly. "I thought it only fair to warn you. You have been a blessing to this household, Miss Fairley. No decent soul could believe such lies." She managed a faint smile, though tears burned behind her eyes. "The world rarely asks decency to judge, only appearances. Shall I speak to his lordship on your behalf?" She shook her head. "No, I will speak for myself. It is time I stop hiding from ghosts." When the vicar left, Blanche stood for a long time before the cold hearth, staring at the unlit logs as though they might offer courage. Her reflection in the glass door looked pale, almost ghostly. She touched the locket at her neck. "Not again," she whispered. "I will not run again." She turned toward the door and found Augustus standing there. He looked as though he had not slept. His cravat was undone, his coat damp from the morning mist, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, quiet fire. "You knew," he said softly. "You knew this would come." "I suspected," she admitted. "Men like Langford do not forgive women who escape their power." He stepped closer. "The vicar told me. They demand I dismiss you." She lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Then you must, my lord. It is your duty." "Do not speak to me of duty," he said, his tone sharp with feeling. "I have lived half my life beneath its weight. It has cost me everything, my wife, my joy, my peace. I will not let it take you too." Her breath trembled. "You cannot defy them, Augustus. Not for me. The children, your title, your position, everything you are will be tainted." And he moved toward her until they stood only a breath apart. "Then let me be tainted," he said quietly. "Let me stand accused if it means standing beside you." Her tears spilled over, though her voice remained calm. "You speak of things you do not understand. This is not some scandal that will fade with time. This is ruin, my lord, complete and permanent ruin." He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers. "Then let us share it." The simplicity of his words broke her. She turned away, pressing her trembling hand to her mouth. "Do not make me believe in miracles," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low. "You brought life back to this house. You taught my children laughter, taught me hope. Why not a miracle too?" She shook her head. "Because love is not enough against a world that despises it." "Then let me despise the world," he said fiercely. She turned back to him then, eyes bright with tears and defiance. "You cannot. You are part of it." For a moment, neither moved. The tension between them was almost unbearable, the quiet thunder of two hearts beating against everything that forbade them. Then Augusta stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath against her hair. "Tell me the truth," he murmured. "Do you love me?" Blanche closed her eyes. "Do not ask me that." "I must." She drew in a shaky breath. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I love you. More than I ever thought myself capable of. But that is why I must leave." He caught her hand again, his grip desperate. "You will not leave me to silence again. Not now." She pulled away, trembling. "I must. For you. For them." At that moment the door burst open. Mrs. Willoughby entered, her face white. "My lord," she said breathlessly, "a messenger has arrived from Gloucester. He carries an official decree." Augustus turned sharply. "Bring it here." The housekeeper hesitated, then handed him the sealed letter. He broke the wax and read quickly, his expression darkening with every line. When he finished, he looked up at Blanche. "They mean to investigate you formally. The bishop himself will send his representative within the week." Blanche went still. "Then it is over." "No," Augustus said, his voice steady but cold. "It is not over until I say it is." He strode to his desk, took up a pen, and began to write with quick, decisive strokes. When he was done, he folded the paper and pressed his seal into the wax. "What are you doing?" Blanche asked, alarmed. "Writing my own letter," he said. "To the bishop, to every man who dares believe slander over truth. They will hear my word against his, and my word carries the weight of this house. You cannot expose yourself like this," she said, stepping closer. "They will accuse you too." He met her gaze with a faint, sorrowful smile. "Then let them. I would rather be accused of love than remembered for silence." Blanche's lips trembled. "You would risk everything?" He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weaken. "For you, Blanche Fairley, there is nothing left to risk that I have not already lost." Before she could answer, the children's laughter drifted faintly from the corridor. Soft, innocent, unaware. It pierced through the storm of their emotions like light through fog. Blanche turned away, pressing her hand against the mantel as tears spilled down her cheeks. "They cannot lose another home," she whispered. "Another mother." His voice softened. "And they will not. For you are both." The words struck her like a prayer she did not deserve. "Please, my lord," she said, her voice trembling, "do not speak of me so. It will break me." He came to stand beside her, his reflection joining hers in the glass of the window. "You were not sent here to be broken, Blanche. You were sent here to mend what grief had destroyed, and you have." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly again, but within the room there was only stillness. The fire on the hearth flickered low, casting their shadows long against the walls. Blanche turned slowly to face him. "If I stay," she whispered, "I will be the cause of your ruin." "If you go," he said, "you will be the cause of my death in all but name." Her breath hitched. "You must not say such things." "Then tell me how else I am to live," he said, stepping closer. "I have lived half my life in the shadow of loss. You are the first light I have seen since." The tears she had held back fell freely now. "And what of duty, of reputation, of all the things that bind us?" He brushed a tear from her cheek, his touch reverent. "Let them bind me, not you." For a long moment they stood there, two souls suspended between reason and longing, between the world's judgment and their own fragile truth. The fire burned low, the letter on the desk cooling beneath its seal, and yet in that small room, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "If I stay, it will not be for duty. It will be for you." He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them, vast and eternal. "Then stay," he said quietly, "and let the world do its worst." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall again, gentle this time, as though the heavens had grown weary of wrath. And before the hearth where the letter still lay cooling, Blanche and Augustus stood in silence, bound not by title or circumstance, but by a love fierce enough to defy the storm that waited beyond the door. The days that followed moved with the quiet tension of a drawn bowstring. Harrowgate looked unchanged from the outside, its stone face calm beneath drifting clouds, its gate still imposing, its windows still tall and watchful. But inside, every room seemed to listen. A letter had been sent with the Marquess's seal. A challenge had been issued to men who believed themselves entitled to judge a woman they had never truly seen. And now the house waited to learn whether truth could stand taller than scandal. Blanche Fairley did not sleep much. She rose before dawn, when the corridors were still dim and the world outside was only a pale suggestion beyond the glass. She moved through her tasks with steady hands, guiding the children through lessons, coaxing them toward their meals, smoothing their hair with gentle fingers, yet beneath her composure, her heart beat like a warning bell. The children felt it too. They had learned to read the air in a room the way other children learn to read a page. Henry watched her more closely than usual, his young face too serious for his age. Thomas tried to be brave, but his temper rose quickly, then dissolved into fear. The little ones clung more often, as if their small arms could hold her in place. At breakfast on the third day, the youngest girl looked up at Blanche with solemn eyes. "Are they going to take you away?" Blanche's throat tightened. She set down her spoon with deliberate calm. "No one can take me anywhere without my own feet walking," she said softly. Henry frowned. "Grown-ups do it all the time." Augustus's chair scraped quietly against the floor as he sat, the sound sharper than usual in the otherwise restrained room. He had joined them more often lately, not as a distant presence, but as a man insisting with stubborn courage on becoming part of the life he had once only supervised. "No one is taking Miss Fairley away," he said, his voice even, his gaze steady on Henry. "Not while I am master of this house." Blanche felt the words settle inside her like a hand placed over a racing heart. She did not look at him too long. She could not afford the tenderness that threatened to rise like tide water. When the children left, Blanche remained by the window, watching their small figures disappear into the corridor. Augustus stayed behind. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, so full it seemed to hum. "You are afraid," he said quietly. She turned, her hands clasped at her waist. "I would be foolish not to be." His eyes softened. "Foolishness has never been your flaw." Blanche tried to smile. "Then it is my turn to learn it." He crossed the room with restrained purpose and stopped before her. The light from the window fell across his face, catching the tired edges around his eyes, softening the severity that had once been his armor. "I have arranged everything," he said. "The bishop's representative arrives this afternoon. The vicar will be present, Mr. Pemberton as well." Blanche's breath caught. "So soon." "So soon," he agreed, "and yet not soon enough for the men who believe they can frighten you out of my home." "My lord," she began, then stopped. His eyes had lifted to hers, and the way he looked at her made the title feel too distant, too cold. He seemed to understand. His voice lowered. "Say my name." Her lips parted. The word trembled in her chest before she could release it. "Augustus." Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the sound of his name from her mouth opened a door he had kept locked for years. "And I will call you what you are," he replied, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Blanche." Her name on his tongue did not feel like scandal. It felt like belonging. It frightened her more than the bishop's decree. The hours passed, with the slow cruelty of waiting. Blanche prepared the children for their afternoon activities, then found herself unable to remain in the nursery. She descended to the ground floor, where the fire in the drawing-room burned low and steady. Mrs. Willoughby stood there, arranging flowers with hands that moved precisely, as though order could hold chaos at bay. "Miss Fairley," the housekeeper said without looking up, "you should sit. You are pale." Blanche did not sit. "Mrs. Willoughby," she said softly, "the letter I received, the one warning me to leave, did you know of it?" The older woman's hands stilled. For a moment her face held a kind of rigid pride, the same pride that had once dressed cruelty in the clothing of propriety. Then something in her eyes shifted, tiredness perhaps, and regret. "I wrote it," Mrs. Willoughby admitted. Blanche went still. "Why?" The housekeeper's voice was tight. "Because I thought you would go before the village sharpened its knives. Because I believed the children would suffer less if they lost you quickly than if they lost you to disgrace. Because I have served this family a long time, Miss Fairley, and I have watched grief turn a man into stone. I feared what would happen if you made him human again." Blanche's breath trembled. "You feared love." "I feared the price of it," Mrs. Willoughby said, her eyes shining with something she would never call tears. "I have seen women ruined for less." Blanche swallowed hard. "And now?" Now Mrs. Willoughby met her gaze, something like reluctant respect in her expression. "Now I see that the children have already paid enough. If there is to be ruin, let it come. I will not add to it." Blanche nodded slowly. The confession did not heal everything, but it closed a wound that had been left open too long. "Thank you," she whispered, because she meant it, not for the letter, for the truth. The carriage arrived just after noon. Blanche stood at the top of the staircase, her hands clasped so tightly her gloves creased. Augustus stood below at the base of the stairs, a calm force in a room that felt suddenly too small for what it was about to contain. Mr. Pemberton hovered near the doorway, with a leather folio held close to his chest. The vicar stood beside him, murmuring a prayer under his breath. The bishop's representative entered, an older man with a measured expression, his coat fine, his posture stiff with authority. Two clerks followed him, papers in hand. "Marquis Hawthorne," the representative said, "I come under instruction." "I understand why you come," Augustus replied, his voice controlled. "But you will hear me before you presume to judge." The representative's gaze drifted upward, landing on Blanche. His mouth tightened faintly. Blanche descended slowly, one step at a time, until she stood beside Augustus. He did not offer her his arm, not as a show. Instead, his hand hovered near hers, close enough to promise support without turning her into a spectacle. The representative opened his folder. "Miss Blanche Fairley is accused of misconduct in a former household. A sworn statement has been delivered. The bishop's office requests her dismissal." Augustus did not flinch. "And I request evidence." "A statement is evidence," the man replied. "No," Augustus said quietly, and the room seemed to tilt toward him. "A statement is an accusation. Evidence is what survives the light." Mr. Pemberton stepped forward then, his folio opening like a long-held breath. "With your leave, my lord," he said, and Augustus nodded once. Pemberton placed papers on the table, letters, receipts, a sealed memorandum bearing a solicitor's mark. Blanche recognized none of it, and yet something in her chest loosened at the sight of preparation. Augustus had not merely defended her with words, he had built a battlefield where truth might win. The representative frowned. "What is this?" "A record," Mr. Pemberton said calmly, "of payments made to Mr. Langford by a man employed as a clerk under Miss Fairley's former guardian. It appears Mr. Langford arranged a false accusation to force Miss Fairley's silence." The representative's eyes narrowed. "That is a serious claim." "It is a documented one," Augustus replied. "You have a statement from a man known for malice and greed. I have records, signatures, and testimony from individuals willing to speak under oath." Blanche's breath caught. Her fingers curled tightly at her waist. She had spent years believing the truth would never return to her, and now it came, quietly, inexorably, through another man's hands. The representative turned to Blanche. "Do you deny the accusation?" Blanche lifted her chin. Her voice did not shake. "I deny wrongdoing. I confess only this. I once protected someone whose reputation was considered more valuable than my own." The clerks paused their writing. The representative's gaze sharpened. "Whom did you protect?" Blanche's chest tightened. For years she had carried that promise like a chain. Breaking it felt like tearing skin from bone. But she looked at the papers on the table, at the steady line of Augustus's shoulders, and she realized that silence had never protected anyone. It had only protected the men who benefited from it. She drew in a slow breath. "I protected a young lady under my guardian's care," she said, voice quiet but clear. "A lady who was targeted by Mr. Langford. He sought to compromise her, to secure influence through scandal. When I intervened, he redirected the ruin toward me. I was accused of a liaison I never had, with a man I never welcomed. My guardian believed me, but his belief cost him his position. I left without proof because proof belonged to those with power." Her eyes burned, but she did not look away. "I carried my silence as virtue. It was only fear dressed as loyalty." Augustus's hand shifted, closer to hers, and for a heartbeat his fingers brushed her glove, an almost touch that steadied her more than any embrace could have. The representative looked at the documents again, then at the vicar, who nodded solemnly. "There will be inquiries," the man said at last, "but it appears the matter is not as simple as the letter suggested." Augustus's voice remained calm, but beneath it lived something fierce. It never was. The representative cleared his throat. "Until the investigation is concluded, Miss Fairley's position cannot be condemned officially." Blanche heard the careful phrasing. It was not exoneration, not yet, but it was a door opening instead of a wall closing. "And in the meantime," Augustus said, "she remains under my protection." The representative hesitated, then nodded once, more concession than approval. "Very well. The bishop's office will be informed." When the men departed, the house seemed to exhale. Even the fire on the hearth crackled as if relieved. Blanche stood motionless, the aftermath roaring in her ears. She had spoken the truth. She had survived it. And yet her legs trembled as if she had run for miles. Augustus waited until the door closed behind the last clerk. Then he turned to her. The room held no witnesses now, but the quiet walls of Harrowgate, walls that had listened to grief for years and were now learning the language of hope. "You were brave," he said softly. Blanche's eyes filled. "I was terrified." "Bravery is never the absence of fear," he murmured. "It is the decision that love matters more." Her breath caught on the word. He stepped closer, so close that the air between them felt warm. "Blanche," he said, and there was no title in his voice now, no distance. "If I offered you a place in this house that no decree could touch, would you take it?" She looked up at him. "You mean—" "I mean my name," he said simply. "My life, my children, my future." Her throat tightened. "Augustus, you cannot bind yourself to a woman with scandal at her heels." He lifted his hand slowly, not touching her cheek yet, only hovering near it as if he respected the fragility of the moment. "I am already bound," he whispered. "I have been since the night I found your voice in my hallway and realized my children were not alone in their grief." Blanche's lips trembled. "And if the world never forgives?" "Then the world will learn to speak without us," he answered, his voice low and steady. "I am done living to satisfy those who never loved me." A tear slid down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb, the touch so gentle it felt like a vow. "You asked me once if I loved you," Blanche whispered, "and I said yes." His eyes darkened with emotion. "Say it again." She did not look away. "I love you," she said, and this time the words were not fear. They were truth. Augustus's breath shuddered, and for a moment his composure cracked, just enough to let the man beneath the title show his longing openly. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a reverent kiss that held more devotion than any grand declaration. "Then marry me," he said softly. "Not as rescue, not as duty, as choice." Blanche's voice broke. "Yes." The word seemed to change the air in the room. Even the light through the window looked different, brighter, as if the house itself recognized what had finally been spoken. They did not kiss then, not fully, not as lovers without restraint, because the world still existed, and the children's footsteps could appear at any moment. But Augustus leaned his forehead to hers briefly, close enough that she felt his breath tremble against her skin. "I will not hide you," he murmured. "And I will not ask you to," she whispered back. When the children were told, the reaction was not quiet. The smallest cried first, not from grief, but from relief, clinging to Blanche as if afraid the word yes might vanish. Thomas broke into a grin so wide it looked painful, then pretended he was too old to smile. Henry stood stiffly, trying to be the man of the house, until Augustus knelt before him. "I will not replace your mother," Augustus said quietly, his voice gentle in a way it had not been in years. "No one can, but I will not live as though loving again betrays her. Will you allow me that?" Henry's eyes shone. He swallowed hard. "If Miss Fairley stays," he said, "then yes." Blanche's heart clenched, and she turned away before anyone could see her cry. That evening, Augustus led Blanche down a corridor she had avoided since the day she discovered it, the sealed wing. The door was unlocked now. The air inside held the faint scent of dried lavender, the ghost of a woman's presence preserved too carefully for too long. Augustus stood still, as if the room might strike him. Blanche did not rush him. She simply waited beside him, her hand near his. "I kept it closed because I thought grief was loyalty," he said quietly. "But it was cowardice." Blanche's voice was soft. It was love that did not know how to breathe. He turned to her, eyes bright with pain and gratitude. "Teach me," he whispered. Blanche stepped closer and laid her hand over his, threading her fingers through his, as if to show him he did not have to face memory alone. Together they opened the curtains. Light spilled into the room, gold and gentle, touching furniture and portraits, and the quiet evidence of a life once lived. In the doorway, the children appeared, hesitant. Blanche beckoned them forward, and Augustus did not stop them. They entered slowly, not as intruders, but as heirs to love. "We will remember her," Augustus said, voice rough, "without turning her memory into a prison." Henry nodded. The younger ones placed small flowers on the windowsill, simple offerings, childlike and sincere. Later, in the quiet of the corridor outside, Augustus turned to Blanche. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will announce it. The village will talk." Blanche's smile trembled. "Let them." He lifted her hand again, holding it as if it were something sacred. "You once told me kindness and order can share a table. You were right." His gaze softened. "Now share my life." Blanche's eyes shone. "Only if you promise to share mine, every imperfect, wounded piece of it." "I promise," he whispered, "and I will spend the rest of my days proving it." When he kissed her then, it was not a scandalous claim. It was a quiet, steady sealing of truth, tender, restrained, trembling with everything they had survived to reach this moment. Blanche's hands rose to his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath fabric and title and history. Outside, the night air smelled of rain and blossoms. Inside Harrowgate, the house that had been built to shelter legacy finally sheltered love. and for the first time in a long time, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like spring. 8 years had passed since the morning Blanche Fairley became the Marchioness of Hawthorne, and Harrowgate had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The ivy had been trimmed back from the stone walls, the gardens had been replanted, and laughter, true, unguarded laughter, had returned to fill the great house. The villagers of Lower Ashcombe spoke of it often. They said that even the air around the estate seemed warmer now, that the great manor, which had once been a place of mourning, had become a place of life. They spoke, too, of the lady of the house, still gentle, still quietly radiant, though the silver now threaded faintly through her chestnut hair. It was early spring again, the anniversary of the day the last storm had broken over their lives. When Blanche stepped into the garden she had once tended with the children, the apple trees were in blossom, their petals soft as the years she had gathered into memory. 2 little girls ran among the flowers, one with her father's dark eyes, and the other with her mother's laughter. Behind them, a boy of 7 followed, earnest, watchful, already protective of his sisters. "Careful with the branches, Emma," Blanche called, smiling as the older girl spun in a whirl of pink skirts and wind. "They break easily." "She says that every year," Augustus murmured as he joined her, his arm brushing against hers. "She means it every year," Blanche replied, glancing up at him. His hair was streaked with grey now, his face more lined, but to her he was still the same man she had defied the world to love, the same man who had chosen her when all of England whispered against them. He smiled faintly, watching their children play. "You've turned this place into something living again. I sometimes forget it ever belonged to sorrow." "It still does, a little," Blanche said softly. "But sorrow and joy can live in the same house. They always have." He turned to her then, his hand finding hers in the quiet way it always did, as if no time could ever teach him to take her presence for granted. "You saved me," he said. She looked up at him, the afternoon light catching in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "We saved each other." The world beyond Harrowgate had changed too. The war that once filled the newspapers had ended, Parliament had turned its gaze toward reform, and in every corner of the country, women like Blanche, women of education, women of quiet resilience, were finding their voices. The scandal that once shadowed her name had long been forgotten, replaced by respect. Some even called her the Lady of Compassion, for she had founded a small school on the edge of the estate, a place for children with no means where they could learn letters and kindness in equal measure. The villagers who had once gossiped now greeted her with warmth. Even Mrs. Willoughby, long retired from her duties, visited the manor once a month, her sharp tongue softened by time. She would sit by the nursery fire and tell the younger children stories of their mother's bravery, though she never called it by that name. As for Henry, the eldest of Augustus's first children, he was now a young man of 20, studying law in London with his father's quiet support and Blanche's endless faith. Thomas, ever restless, had joined the Navy. The younger girls were soon to make their debuts in society, though Blanche often said she would rather they find love in the quiet way she had, in the glance that outlasted the music of a dance, in the silence that meant devotion rather than duty. Sometimes, when she walked the halls in the still hours of evening, Blanche would stop before the old west corridor, the one where it had all begun, where sorrow and hope had first collided. She still remembered that night, the trembling boy, the broken vase, the man who had once stood on the other side of anger and discovered grace instead. There, by the small window that overlooked the orchard, hung a portrait now, the first of her painted after the birth of their youngest child. The artist had captured her not as a lady of rank, but as a woman holding an open book, her expression serene, her eyes alight with thought. Beside it hung Augustus's portrait, painted years later, the 2 frames close enough that their shadows touched each other whenever the afternoon sun passed through the window. In the village church, another story lingered, one less often told. Mr. Langford, The man whose lies had once nearly destroyed her had fallen from favor years ago. His dealings were exposed, his fortune lost. He died far from London, leaving nothing but debts and a reputation too tarnished even for gossip. It was said that on his deathbed he had spoken Blanche's name, though whether in regret or bitterness no one could say. She never asked. She had already forgiven him long before she knew he was gone. And so the years folded softly upon themselves. Seasons came and went. Grief grew gentler. Love grew surer. One evening, as twilight settled over the hills, Augustus and Blanche sat together on the terrace. The same terrace where they had once danced beneath the startled eyes of a watching world. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and roses. The house behind them glowed with the warm light of family, laughter echoing faintly through open windows, footsteps upstairs, the sound of a piano playing a melody one of the girls had composed herself. Augustus lifted a glass of wine, his hand brushing hers. "Do you remember the night the storm broke?" he asked. "I remember everything," she said, smiling faintly. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw both the man he had been and the one he had become. "I used to think love was something that consumed. I didn't know it could endure." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Love endures only when it learns to forgive," she said quietly, "and we had much to forgive, of ourselves most of all." The sky deepened to violet, the stars beginning to appear. Their youngest daughter, Emma, ran onto the terrace, her curls wild, her hands full of flowers. "Mama, look! I found the first bloom of spring!" Blanche smiled, taking the small blossom. White, delicate, fragile as memory. She held it for a moment, then placed it on the table beside them. "The last bloom of Harrowgate," Augustus murmured, tracing her fingers lightly. Blanche turned her face toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "No," she said, "the first of many." The wind rose gently, carrying the laughter of their children across the garden, mingling it with the rustle of the trees and the distant bells of Lower Ashcombe. Harrowgate, once silent, now lived and breathed around them, a home, not a monument. And as the evening deepened into quiet, the light from the house spilled softly onto the terrace, illuminating two figures seated close together. An old love made new each day, a promise kept, a life redeemed. The Marquis and Marchioness of Hawthorne remained there long after the stars came out, hand in hand, listening to the voices that would carry their story, long after both were gone. The story of a house reborn, of love that defied the world, and of a woman whose courage taught even sorrow how to bloom. Some stories do not end with the turning of a final page. They continue to echo softly in our hearts, reminding us that love, when born from courage, has the power to heal what life once broke. Blanche and Augustus taught us that true strength is not in defying the storm, but in standing together when the storm has passed. They showed us that redemption is possible, that forgiveness is a quiet kind of bravery, and that even in a world ruled by judgment, compassion can still rewrite destiny. Their journey reminds us that love is not only for the young or the unscarred. It belongs to those who have known loss and still choose tenderness, to those who dare to hope when hope seems foolish. Harrowgate bloomed again because two hearts refused to surrender to fear, and perhaps, if we listen closely, we can still hear their laughter carried by the wind, proof that love, once planted, never truly fades. If this story moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what touched you most, and if you made it to this very moment, write the word bloom, because like Blanche and Augustus, you know that even after winter, something beautiful always returns. Your presence here means more than words can say. If you wish to help our team continue creating stories like the last bloom of Harrowgate, you can send us super thanks with whatever amount your heart allows. Every gesture helps us keep these tales alive. And if you cannot support us that way, simply sharing this video with a friend or loved one already helps more than you know. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, feeling, and believing that love, no matter how tested, always finds its way home. Don't forget to watch the other stories waiting for you in the cards above. Each one carries its own heartbeat, its own bloom.